So let's have a look now at John Key and how he began his life as a foreign exchange dealer. And this all happened way back in the 1980s under the David Lange and Roger Douglas government, when they allowed the international bankers to come into New Zealand and virtually take over the country on the finance side.
Making decisions at very fast, instantaneous decisions.
Are you aware you're talking about millions, sometimes billions of dollars? Is it real money to you?
Yes, it is actually. I think so, yes.
15:30?
No, 17.
So how good at his job is John Key?
He's exceptional. He is one of the best that I've seen in my 12 years within the markets.
And what makes him good?
John has an uncanny ability to know when to hold positions, when to cut positions.
Can you say this year how many days you would have lost money?
I'd prefer not to really, but it's relatively low.
Why not?
It's probably prudent not to.
Most dealers are happy if they lose money only one day in every 5. Close-Up understands John Key has failed to show a profit only one day this year.
He seems to have a sixth sense with respect to where the market is about to move to. We're not talking about in a matter of 5 minutes or a matter of an hour or a matter of 5 days. We're talking about in the next 5 seconds. That John seems to be able to read what is going on in the markets by what he's hearing through the broker boxes, through the other competitors ringing through asking for prices or us ringing the other competitors. He just seems to know just a little bit quicker than most people exactly what's going to happen next.
So what do you do to look after him?
We certainly pay him adequately.
And the reason that John Key was able to be so successful as a foreign currency dealer was not because he was psychic, but because he was inside trading with Andrew Kreiger from the Bankers Trust in New York, which is controlled by the Jewish international bankers, particularly the Rothschilds. And he was using derivatives, which means that he was taking $100,000 and turning that into $30 or $40 million. And that enabled him to make large purchases of the New Zealand currency, which was only a small currency. And so he would buy at a low price, and he pushed the market down with John Key to around about 5%. And we know that then he was able to make millions of dollars by reselling it. And so this is how it was done way back in 1987 while he was working for Elders. And then in 1988 he went and worked for the Bankers Trust in Auckland. And then later on he moved to Sydney to work for Merrill Lynch, which is the trading arm of the Bank of America. Then he went to Singapore and also to London, where he headed up the derivatives section there. And then he was able to go to America and end up owning shares in the Bank of America. And so in 2011 John Key gave this speech in Auckland, and he was talking about banking and also Merrill Lynch and the Bank of America.
So let's talk about the economy for just a minute. This is the position of what has happened over the last sort of, 10 or so years in New Zealand. So we've built up a lot of debt, and it's primarily not at the government level, it's actually at what's called the private sector. So it's mum and dad, right across New Zealand, businesses, farms, the whole 9 yards. We owe lots of money. So much so that we owe 85% of it to foreigners. So we owe 85% of our economy, and the overwhelming bulk of it is to foreigners. So no OECD country, so there are 30 countries in the world that are developed economies, no country in the world borrows a bigger percentage of their money from foreigners than New Zealand.
John Penny Brights, I hope to be seeing you in Parliament after the Botany by-election.
Oh, good. I won't wish you luck, just Jamie Lee Ross is our guy, and I think he'll do a fabulous job, but we like democracy though.
Regarding a grown-up conversation about debt, Prime Minister, on the 26th of January, I sent you an Official Information Act request asking, on a line-by-line accounting basis, could you please provide the detailed information which shows exactly to whom New Zealand has become indebted since National-led government came to power in November 2008. And I asked in particular the information which confirms whether or not New Zealand has become indebted to the Bank of America, any subsidiaries of the Bank of America, or any lending institutions of any form which have connections to the Bank of America. I have yet to have an acknowledgement to this request. The reason why I'm asking, Prime Minister, is because according to the Register of Pecuniary Interest, you are a shareholder in the Bank of America, and are you personally profiting from New Zealand's growing indebtedness? And when will I get an answer to my question?
Sadly, no, I'm not. So you get an answer of due to, of course, that comes from those people who put that together. I wouldn't have a clue whether they borrowed any money off them. If they would, they do it at commercial rates. And the reason I'm a shareholder of Bank of America is because I was a very long-term shareholder of Merrill Lynch. When I was at a company that was very well run, but unfortunately when I left it wasn't, and Bank of America bought them when they went broke.
And so despite the impression that John Key gave, the government debt has actually doubled since he became Prime Minister, and also the GDP to debt ratio has trebled, which means that New Zealand is going backwards. And the other thing is that the derivatives trading that John Key was famous for is the thing that caused the financial crisis in 2008. And the American taxpayers had to bail out Merrill Lynch and the Bank of America to the tune of billions of dollars.
Let me ask you about the process that you went through in determining to give Bank of America $15 billion in October. Why that number? How did you come up with that number?
I did not develop that number. I'm sure it was related to the size of the firm and its capital ratios.
Who came up with that number?
I'm not certain. It was probably Treasury, but I'm not certain.
You're not certain who came up with the number?
No.
And so the $10 billion that was given to Merrill Lynch at a subsequent point in time, you don't know who came up with that number either?
This was TARP money, and this was the Treasury's responsibility.
Treasury Secretary Paulson and Fed Chairman Bernanke faced tough questioning on the bailout from the House Finance Committee last week. Some of the toughest questioning coming from Congressman Brad Sherman of California, one of the bailout's biggest opponents. Congressman Sherman joins us now from Capitol Hill. Congressman, good to have you with us. What is the basis of your opposition to this bill? I mean, we've heard from the Democratic leadership it's just boffo. We've heard from the White House that it's just boffo. What's the problem?
I'd like to see a bill that I could support. This bill has three major problems. The first is that Paulson gets the $700 billion, goes up to Wall Street, and gets to hand it out to whomever he wants for whatever toxic assets they choose to sell, without any control. Now, the White House will agree that he will be subject to a control board, but made up exclusively of Bush cronies. They'll be the only ones that can tell him to stop. There'll also be a review board, but that one just issues press releases. It can't stop anything. The second problem is the current bill. They're saying we're going to limit him to only $200 or $300 billion. The fact is he gets all $700 billion. We could pass a resolution to stop the second 350, but he can veto that resolution, so it would take 2/3 of both houses.
So the Treasury Secretary gets a veto over the United States Congress.
No, the President gets the veto. I don't know. I don't really draw a distinction between. I mean, my view is, Hank Paulson is George Bush, without the hair.
Well,
I'm not. I mean, Hank knows more about the financial services industry, but they are part of the same administration, and they're going to try to achieve the same values.
Well, at this point, it looks like after some rather optimistic statements by Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill and the White House earlier today, it looks like this negotiation is far from near any kind of successful resolution.
Well, Bush could have had a bill on his desk today if he had agreed to some controls on his power and agreed to real controls on executive compensation for the bailed out firms.
Well, they've been very, there's no sense of what the heck they mean when they say controls on executive compensation. Were we going to do, as Senator John McCain suggested, limit that CEO's salary to $400,000 or what?
Well, they're deliberately hiding the ball. The only executive compensation that Bush will tolerate are limits on certain types of esoteric bonus formulas, but he draws the line at the $1 million a month salary. In other words, if an executive is staying with the firm and he's getting paid $1 million a month, maybe they want to give him a raise to $1.5 million a month, his position is, we can't stop that. And as long as he takes that position, he's probably not going to get a bill passed.
Well, Congressman Sherman, let me just say to you, if the President of the United States arrogantly and willfully would say such a thing and would demand such a thing, if there is anyone who supports that bailout, the American people will revolt. I mean, who are these people? Who is Henry Paulson? Who is your leadership, Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, that they would accommodate this kind of nonsense?
They're reacting to the big fear machine that is saying the markets will drop, the sky will fall.
Is anybody afraid of the culture of excess and greed and absolute indifference to the welfare of this nation, the national interest that's been created on Wall Street and in corporate America? Is anybody afraid of that culture?
They're more afraid of voters getting mad if the market drops tomorrow. And now Wall Street there will be a few on Wall Street who will realize that the way to scare Congress again is to make sure the market drops precipitously tomorrow, and then they can say, look, we noticed that the deal isn't going through quickly, and look what happens to the market. You guys have to go in on Saturday and pass the deal the way we want it. And we have to stand up to that and recognize that if we're going to do a bill, it's got to be a bill with adequate controls.
Brad Sherman, thank you very much for being here. Congressman Sherman, appreciate it.
And so the derivative trading that John Key was famous for actually created the bubble that burst and created the financial crisis. And when he became a member of Parliament, he was caught out with insider trading once again to do with Transrail.
Welcome back now to our lead story, and apologies, we've had some technical difficulties in bringing this story to you. But tonight we can reveal dramatic new information about John Key's share market dealings.
Challenged by One News, the former merchant banker who wants to be Prime Minister was forced to make an embarrassing admission about how many Transrail shares he owned. For the first time, Mr Key's admitted he owned a great deal more than he'd previously revealed. And critically, the national leader owned those shares while he was pushing for another firm to buy into Transrail. Deputy Political Editor Francesca Mold's been investigating this exclusive story and joins us now live with the details. Fran.
Good evening. Well, if you remember a couple of months back, we discovered that John Key's family trust owned 30,000 shares in Transrail. Now, the government attacked him for that at the time, saying it was inappropriate for him to be a shareholder when he was openly criticising the government's plan to buy that company. Well, in a surprise twist, a Labour Party researcher has uncovered more documents showing that family trust owned many more shares than has previously been admitted, and shares were even bought and sold in John Key's own name. Now, here's how the trading saga played out. The share register shows that on February the 15th, 2002, a trust owned by John Key and his wife Brona buys 30,000 Transrail shares, estimated to cost around $108,000. 4 days later, on the 19th of February, the trust buys another 20,000 shares worth around $72,000. These are shares we were never told about. In July 2002, John Key is elected to Parliament and over the next few months becomes National's Associate Transport Spokesman. He questions Michael Cullen in writing and in the House about so-called secret meetings between the government and Transrail, but he fails to reveal his shareholding. Then on May the 7th, 2003, John Key buys another 50,000 shares, this time under his own name, for an estimated $22,500. A couple of weeks later, he meets with Rail America, which is considering a bid for Transrail. In his newsletter, John Key writes, "I hope the interest shown by Rail America will be picked up by others." He still doesn't admit he's a shareholder. On June 10, John Key sells his personal parcel of 50,000 shares for about $51,000, doubling his profit in just 5 weeks. A day later, John Key intensely questions Michael Cullen about the Transrail deal at a select committee. At that hearing, Richard Prebble declares his own conflict as a director and shareholder of Mainfreight. John Key says nothing. 2 days later, his family trust sells its shares, this time at a loss, recouping $48,000 of their original $180,000 investment. On June 18, Mr Key attacks the government over its plan to buy the rail tracks.
Fran, I'm sure you put these revelations to John Key. What's his response been?
Well, essentially, John Key's never owned up to those extra shares, despite a number of interviews with journalists about the issue. But that changed today when I caught up with him on the campaign trail. Now, I can tell you I've known him a number of years and he's always been very affable and friendly. But today he looked extremely uncomfortable and unsettled when confronted with the evidence.
And I've already explained in the previous episode about New Zealand how the foreign ownership of our banks has taken place, with the ANZ and the BNZ and the Westpac and the ASB all being major trading banks here in New Zealand which have total foreign ownership. And of course, New Zealand is now a tax haven for money laundering for the elite around the world, and they pay no tax to New Zealanders whatsoever.
The Revenue Minister says New Zealand isn't a tax haven for wealthy foreigners, despite a 60 Minutes report showing wealthy foreigners dodging inland revenue by using trusts here. While some might call it tax evasion, Peter Dunn describes it as, in his words, legitimate tax avoidance, and the Prime Minister backs him. Here's Patrick Gower.
Inland Revenue, also known as the tax man, has always claimed it's our job to be fair. But now the Revenue Minister says when it comes to wealthy foreigners funneling money here to avoid paying tax, that's, well, fair enough.
I think the term tax haven is a gross exaggeration because it implies illegality, it implies tax evasion rather than legitimate tax avoidance.
Yes, Peter Dunn said, quote, legitimate tax avoidance, even though the Inland Revenue website says tax avoidance is wrong and the average taxpayer on the street says Dunn is wrong too. Do you think there's such a thing as legitimate tax avoidance? No. Is that fair?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
I mean, everyday citizens have to pay it, students have to pay it, so I think everyone should have to pay it.
I'm actually not smart enough to do tax evasion. I wouldn't even know how.
The government's desire for a tax take saw it introduce what's been dubbed the paperboy tax this year. But on this avoidance issue, the Prime Minister says Dunn has got it right.
But he'll be using the absolutely correct technical terms. So there are two things that are talked about in tax law, going back to my days when I studied at university, tax evasion and tax avoidance. Well, there's actually quite a legitimate business in New Zealand for servicing foreign trusts.
Key says under the law, tax evasion is illegal, but tax avoidance is not.
The Prime Minister's telling ordinary taxpayers that they're there to pay all the taxes, to pay for the schools and hospitals, and billionaires and the ultra-rich don't have to pay tax.
Look, tax avoidance, tax evasion, it's basically the same thing.
There are 3 million New Zealanders paying income tax. Peter Dunn wasn't commenting further today, so we asked Inland Revenue for a list of legitimate tax avoidance measures like those used by foreign trusts. As yet, no concrete answers. Patrick Gower, 3 News.
But then in 2016, with the release of the Panama Papers, the New Zealand public found out that New Zealand was in fact a tax haven for the elite.
Kia ora, good evening. New Zealand's been named as a tax haven in the biggest information leak in history. The documents expose how the world's rich and powerful, like Russian President Vladimir Putin, hide their money.
We're listed as one of the countries used by foreigners to set up highly secretive trusts to conceal the movement of money and the identities of those involved. And these outfits pay no taxes here. Today's revelations prompted renewed calls for our laws to be tightened. Analysis from political editor Corin Dan shortly, but first he has details and reaction.
The tiny nation of Malta is right now being rocked by a tax scandal involving a government minister, a secret company in Panama and little old New Zealand.
The trust for New Zealand għandu kumpanija fil-Panama.
Details of a secret Kiwi tax trust set up by a Maltese minister confirmed in a massive leak of documents from this Panamanian law firm, Mossack Fonseca. The lawyers specialise in finding tax havens for the world's wealthy.
We are kind of clean, trustworthy. To allow arrangements like this makes us look dodgy and shady.
But John Key says he knows nothing about the Maltese trust and insists New Zealand is not a tax haven.
We're a party to a series of different treaties. New Zealand has got a clean bill of health in the 2013 OECD review, and we meet our obligations.
New Zealand doesn't tax foreign income earned by foreigners, and under our tax law there is nothing illegal in a foreigner setting up a trust here.
So in New Zealand we allow foreign trusts to register and be administered here, and when they do that they have to disclose to the Inland Revenue that they are here and being administered, and that's the full extent of their requirements.
A quick check of the internet shows plenty of Kiwi firms touting for business to help set them up. Many of them highlighting the fact New Zealand, as part of the OECD, isn't on any tax blacklists and has stable government.
There's a legitimate business in terms of trusts. There has been for a very long period of time. We've implemented the laws which were passed, say, back in 1988, and they've been consistent over successive governments.
But opposition parties fear people could abuse our tax laws to launder money or dodge tax.
Back in 2013, the IRD warned that New Zealand foreign trusts were a risk, and we needed to have some regulatory reform, but the government has completely failed to act on this issue.
Inland Revenue says it has a very active compliance program focused on those who engage in abusive offshore arrangements that don't meet tax obligations.
And that's probably the area for some more inquiry as to whether New Zealand is doing enough to test the compliance of these foreign trusts.
John Key insists he's happy with compliance for now, but is open to change if that's what's recommended by the OECD.
All right, Corin. John Key, quite rattled at questioning by media today. He can't be happy with how this is making us look internationally.
No, look, he denies. He says he's not embarrassed by this and doesn't see any big issue. But clearly, while it may not be illegal, certainly there is a perception around tax havens which isn't a good look for New Zealand. And you have to ask the question why it is New Zealand even wants this. So, look, he was rattled by that today because I suppose he's saying this is something New Zealand has been doing for a long time. And there are, I guess, valid questions as to why New Zealand hasn't done anything about it. And I say perceptions because there are media in Australia who do talk about us as a tax haven, whether John Key likes it or not. Now, this, of course, came to light because of this extraordinary leak of documents from this company in Panama. Here's Paul Hobbs with more on that.
Panama's glittering carnival's a worldwide attraction for tourists, but many others come here to avoid the glare, wealthy investors wanting secrecy.
You can go to Panama and you can get a foundation or a trust or a company, and you can use those complicated, slightly strange structures to hide and disguise your ownership and control of assets.
An enormous leak of files from this company, Mossack Fonseca, shows how 11.5 million documents spanning nearly 40 years, 1,000 times larger than any of the WikiLeaks. The anonymous source first approached the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung, which then shared the information with a consortium of investigative journalists. The cloak of secrecy now lifted on thousands of the world's richest businessmen and celebrities, even a top football star. The BBC's Panorama programme has found links to 72 current and former heads of state.
You could sit here, please.
Like Iceland's Prime Minister Sigmundur Gunnlaugsson, who, the documents show, had a secret stake in an offshore company. It held his wife's interests in Iceland's banks, worth millions of dollars, but no one knew this when her husband was dealing with the bank's collapse. He denies any wrongdoing and walked out of this interview. Mossack Fonseca says its services are commonly used worldwide and they are responsible members of the global financial and business community. But some of the deals in the files are extraordinary. Panorama believes it's found $1 billion laundering operation in Russia involving this man, cellist Sergei Roldugin. He's a close friend of Russian President Vladimir Putin and was the owner of 2 companies which benefited from suspicious deals. For example, an offshore company borrowed $6 million. 3 months later, the loan was written off for just $1.
Does it look like money laundering?
Yes, it does look like money laundering to me, for sure.
For now, Roldugin isn't answering questions. Many more are expected to face similar scrutiny. Paul Hobbs, One News.
Corin, this doesn't look like an issue that's going to go away quickly. What do you think will happen now?
Well, we know in Australia it's being reported that the tax office over there is looking into about 800 wealthy Australians due to alleged links with this company. IRD here says it will look to see if there are any New Zealand residents who have arrangements with it as well. And of course the thing is, there's so many documents in this leak that you have to imagine that there's going to be a lot more information coming out.